Boardroom Bound, Episode 81, an inside look at healthcare boardrooms with Jessica Bell Vanderwall. Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's episode, we're speaking with Jessica Bell Vanderwall, and she is going to talk us through her story of becoming an expert in her field, becoming known for that, being asked to join her first board seat, and then leveraging that opportunity, gaining more experience, going to a specialist educational system that allowed her to gain more credibility, to getting a board seat in the private sector, and in how she's going about finding more boards today and doing the networking and the branding she needs to for that. Easily actionable advice that we can all take as we are on our own journeys to do that. Let's jump into the show. Jessica Bell Vanderwall, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Great. Thank you so much for having me on.
Well, I am delighted because this is one of those stories that I think all of our listeners can relate to because we're all on a journey somewhere. And some of us, it might be very early days thinking at some point, I would like to do this. Others are actively seeking it now. Others may have already achieved that first role going, oh my gosh, what do I get myself into? How do I do it? And you're on that path and journey. And I think it'd be really helpful to people to understand maybe the precursor, how that journey began and the background to it. So maybe you can set the scene for us.
Absolutely. So, when I think about, in particular, my board career, I have to be honest, I kind of stumbled upon boards through my work with nonprofits. It's always been important for me to give back to my community and to others. And so in every city I've lived in, I've always been committed to that effort outside of my day-to-day. And so it just happened that one of the nonprofits I was passionate about was Bay Area Girls on the Run. So obviously a larger national organization, but the Bay Area chapter I got involved in as a running coach. And it's an organization that is really geared towards boosting confidence in young girls through a running and coaching program. And it's a phenomenal program, I have to say, for anybody that hasn't actually learned about it or gotten involved. And I joined as a coach initially because I love running, and actually I derived a lot of value from my early experiences in sports. And then, interestingly enough, I kind of stumbled upon some of the board leadership through their volunteer efforts as well. And it just so happened that the board needed some support and expertise in marketing, and that's an area of expertise I have. So I stepped in. And that was kind of my first jump into the world of boards. And that was also my first kind of experience where it was melding worlds, the day-to-day career I had and outside organizations or outside companies. Now, interestingly enough, around the same time, though, our family business actually back in North Carolina was starting to shift, and I had the privilege of joining the board of advisors there. And I'd say that gave me a different flavor of board leadership in the private sector. Mm-hmm. And I think what was interesting about that experience is, I had some perspective on the business lens from my family, but as I transitioned into a board role, I got to see obviously a new side of things. And I was also the only independent director. So I was the only one that wasn't an employee. And so that had a new and unique dynamic for me. There's obviously pros and cons to that sort of thing. But what I learned was diversity of thought and perspective was super critical. And so candidly, given that experience and the one with Girls on the Run, I was hungry to learn more. How can I be the best board leader? What does a good board look like? And that's what ultimately led me to go back to Harvard, where I got my MBA and attend their Women on Board Executive Leadership Program and certificate, and joined many of the communities such as 2020 Women on Boards and others to further contribute some of my board experience examples, and also to better understand, how to get more involved.
There's a lot there that we can unpack. That is fantastic. Let's pick up on a little bit that it almost went by so fast. It was they were looking for X and I am X. There was a match,
Yep.
right? And
Yep.
How do I explain this? For some people, when they think about, let's say you're leaving college and you get your first job. Hey, I'm smart.
Yeah.
I'm hardworking. I can learn it. That might work on some jobs. It doesn't work for all when you're pitching. It certainly doesn't work in the boardroom. I'm a generalist.
Yep.
I'll figure it out is not what they want. Let's unpack your story a little bit more. How did that actually go from they need X, I am X, we'll get together?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I do think you actually have to get even clearer about what you can bring to a board or that industry with a board experience versus kind of your professional experience. And so I think in this specific example, again, a lot of it kind of happens, I'd say, informally, right? So I got the experience of coming across and meeting some of the different board members as I was going through the experience as a coach. And I met them, had coffee with them, learned more about them. And again, I think by just asking questions, being curious, wondering, what was the experience like? Where were they struggling, et cetera? It kind of serendipitously evolved to, oh, so it sounds like where you're actually needing some additional support is marketing. How do we better promote these programs? And for me, that light bulb kind of came on, I actually can help you here. And I think, again, that was really the foray for me to say, I think there's something I can do. It doesn't even have to be a board leadership role, but, how can I help you? Because I want you to be successful. So again, I think a lot of it can happen informally and through networking. And, honestly, too, as I watch others step into board roles, what I often find is that a lot of it is through informal conversations, networking, connections, et cetera. It's not as much on the formal front of submitting your resume, to your point, and applying for a job. It's actually getting to know individuals and asking questions and being curious. So that's really how it evolved for me, at least.
Well, let's compare this because some of our listeners are in different places in the world. And Europe,
Sure.
for example, especially in the UK where I lived for 7 years, a fair number of board roles, especially if you're in sort of those quangos, quasi-government, quasi-private sector roles, are actually posted online. And you can find them and you can apply for them. And there's nothing bad about doing that. I do liken that to the transition that we've seen in, let's say, applying for a job in America from whether it's a job board like Monster or Indeed or LinkedIn to an individual company site. It's a bit like a black hole when it goes in. Where I worked at JP Morgan before, they were so busy, they wouldn't get back to you unless they wanted to talk to you in an interview. You just never heard anything. And applying online for a board role, probably nothing bad with it, but probably not going to yield success. You're talking about the networking. We know at the end of the day, statistics can range maybe between 2/3 and 3/4 of board roles are filled through networks. It's just a fact, and that's the way it is. You cannot underestimate the importance of the networking. And it sounds like you knew that and you were aware of that. And clearly from your different roles at different corporations like Deloitte and Nike, you probably built strong brands and reputations. And Harvard Business School clearly gave you some more people to know. Can you talk to us about how you are tapping into that today as you think about going forward? Because clearly you would like more board opportunities. How do you think about using those great resources that you have?
Yeah, it's a really good question. To your point, I think, I've worked at companies of all shapes and sizes and a variety of functions. And I really like going where the energy is or even the chaos is. So, that's kind of how I have moved through roles is, I want to go where there's energy, where there's need. And I think I similarly use that same thought process as it, relates to board leadership or nonprofit or other extracurriculars, as you may call them, outside of the office. Where can I actually be most impactful? And I think, especially when I look at my transition from the startup world into being an advisor for startups, I realized too that, a lot of companies, organizations, et cetera, really benefit from external individuals and their thoughts and their perspectives, just like I was mentioning, even with our family business, having that independent director, that different thought process is really important. And so, again, I'm kind of constantly on the hunt and constantly looking for conversations where, I can provide them with some support and think about ways that I can leverage a lot of the skills and resources that, I've actually taken forward to support them. I definitely am always thinking about how to pay it forward to organizations in particular. So yeah, I think there's a lot of lessons I have taken from my professional career into the board leadership and, kind of quote unquote application process, if that makes sense.
I think it'd be really interesting to understand what it was like for someone going to a private company board, because when I talk to most people, and often what I hear from someone is, I want to get a board seat. And I liken that when you say, I want to get a job, like break it down a little bit more for me. Let's be specific. One specific could be public company board, which is what most people would say. And I would argue, first of all, there's a lot more opportunities in the private world. If you think about venture capital, private equity, family-run businesses are a great example. There are many of them out there, and they need good board members too. You might argue in a litigious world, maybe it's a better place to start and cut your teeth, etc. But maybe you can help people understand it. Just because you're with a private company doesn't mean it's not professional. Doesn't mean it's not a great opportunity. What's it actually been like for you? Can you sort of compare and contrast with probably what most of us picture, maybe like JP Morgan's public company board?
Yeah, it's a great question. Now, again, to be clear, I have not, or I'm not currently serving on a public company board, although I've talked with many individuals that have. And I think, the reality is in the public realm, there's a lot more scrutiny, for sure. But I think in the private or even nonprofit world, right, that's a great opportunity, to your point, to get experience and to really dig in. And I think it's also really a tremendous opportunity for you to, learn the steps and the kind of key things you need to be mindful of to be an effective board leader. So being prepared, being diligent, reading the materials that come through, being curious, like I mentioned, don't make assumptions, but also don't be too directive, and actually, see how the board dynamic actually evolves and how you can contribute. And then I think the last thing is, recognizing your unique perspective. I can imagine that, it can feel very onerous or intimidating to join a board, especially when everybody else is, maybe somebody that's more experienced or has obviously served on the board longer than you. And I think, I definitely have, quote unquote, practiced through my nonprofit experience and also my family business experience, realizing my unique perspective. And I think that has thus given me even more confidence as I move forward to join other companies' boards, again, making sure I know, where my place is and where I can actually add value. So again, I think there's no substitution for actually just getting the experience. And I think those two realms are a tremendous place to start.
And I imagine another part of it, and let's talk about your story, is you talked about being the only independent director on that board. And people come with biases to every situation. You come with certain background and experiences and expectations. Walking into a room, unlike, say, a public company board where maybe they're worried more about, okay, do we have someone from academia? Do we have someone who has this background and that background, et cetera? You're coming with people who have a lot more assumptions. You and I were both strategy consultants in various parts of our life. I liken it to when you walk in and you're telling someone who's been doing the job for 40 years, I've got ideas about how to do it better. You're walking into a private company, people who've lived it and breathed it every single day, as opposed to a board director might be showing up once a month or once a quarter. Can you give us an understanding what that feels like and how you've grown in that role?
Yeah, no, it's a great example to point out, because I think the consultant's lens is a perfect analogy to the way I've felt, where you kind of throw your recommendations, quote unquote, over the wall and everybody rolls their eyes and says, well, you don't work here. And I think to your point, I had a similar experience when I first walked into our family business. And, I, again, kind of came from the outside. And that's why I think, at least from my perspective, those kind of, quote unquote, essential board member skills are so important, because, take, for example, with our family business, it is in industrial distribution. My career has been spent almost entirely in healthcare. That is not my industry area of expertise. And actually, I think that is good, because as a result, I walked in, I knew that I didn't know the space. And so I had to do a lot of research. I had to do a lot of reading. I had to, try to absorb as much as possible from other individuals. And as a result, I didn't walk in overly confident and say, I know the industry better than you. And so, again, being prepared, being thoughtful about what you do and don't know, and not take for granted that you have any better perspective than anyone else in the room. So again, I actually, did as much reading and research as possible. And I was also, to my point earlier, I was curious, but I was mindful not to, be the person in the room always raising my hand or always interjecting, right? If anything, I would actually, flag something to the chair in advance and say, I'm curious if we're going to talk about X, Y, and Z. Or, I'd ask, is there a time that we might be able to discuss, A, B, or C? Again, I tried to do it almost behind the scenes so that right out of the gate, I wasn't kind of tagged as a know-it-all, because I think that would be really easy to do. And then again, like I said, I think just realizing, though, that there are certain situations where my different perspective is critical. I did want to make sure that I didn't just kind of sit there and nod all day, too. And so if I did see something that was alarming, I would definitely at least take it offline with either the chair or the CEO and say, I just want to better understand what's happening on this specific topic. And I didn't just assume that everyone else knew better. But again, I think a lot of it is be prepared, be curious, but also be mindful that you want to set an example from day one, that you're there to learn and you're there to help, not to point in the direction of where everyone else should go.
There's a hard balance at the very beginning, not only with a new opportunity at a company, even if you're a seasoned director, but especially if you're a first-time director, because you are there to add value and they would like to see you add value quickly, but you also need to learn not only the dynamics of the room and the organization and maybe perhaps the industry if it's brand new to you. So you're trying to find your way. And I think one of the best pieces of advice I got was from Betsy Atkins when she and I were talking during her episode. She said, liken it to a baseball game. And you come up to bat, maybe 3, perhaps 4 times in a typical game.
Yep.
That's about how many times you should be talking over the course of a board day, because everybody else is also thinking, I have lots of value and good points that I want to make. Is that,
Absolutely.
Do you feel like that's representative of the way that you go about it?
Absolutely. And I think, I can even liken it to, there's a ramp as well, right? Again, so, at the first board meeting, I didn't try to hit that 3-question, average right then and there. Again, I think some boards also are going to be better than others at orientation. And I think, to be very blunt, family businesses are probably not going to be very mindful of that because they've got a lot to do. It's not going to be their, number one priority to educate the new independent director. And so I had to kind of, quote unquote, orient myself right from the get-go. And a lot of that meant meeting with each other board director separately and getting to know them, getting to know, what they were concerned about. And, what's interesting is, as you can imagine, these are people I knew, right? But I hadn't actually heard their perspective on a lot of the business topics. And so I had to do my own little reconnaissance and orientation behind the scenes. And so, again, I think there's also just time to ramp and time to do a little bit of that background research, one-on-one with the other board directors.
And let's not underestimate that as well, because you're asked to come in on an infrequent basis to work very efficiently and effectively with a small group of people who are all really intelligent, lots of ideas. Building those relationships is essential, and you don't want to do it just when you're there. Clearly, let's say you're there for an overnight for the 2 boards and you got time for a dinner and connect. How are you also doing that in between meetings? What's the best way that you've found?
Yeah, it's a great point. I honestly just try to use the informal coffee, informal take you to lunch type of approaches. When can I, come over and I can take you to lunch and we can just chat in offline. Again, and I try to do that in a way that is mindful of their schedule. Not everybody's going to want to spend time with me in that first month. And so I try to be really open-minded about what's going to work well for them. But, making time to do those coffees or those lunches separate from the board meetings and kind of almost separate from the day-to-day as possible too. For example, I actually met with a couple of individuals on weekends because that's when it works best for them. So I was mindful of, their schedules and really being conscious of what was going to work well for them. One of the individuals just said, I have time for a 15-minute phone call. And after the 15-minute phone call, then we set up a lunch. And so, again, a lot of individuals were skeptical of my role from day one. And so you have to kind of build those relationships and you have to do whatever it takes to kind of get there. And it might be incremental, to be very honest.
Well, my wife reminds me constantly that you cannot rush familiarity, and it is a process, but most people are not joining a board for 6 months anyway. You're talking, let's say you're joining a public
Right.
company board, you're probably assuming 9 years would be about the typical lifespan. So I think that is
Right.
good time well spent. And I would love to hear, we've been talking about a lot of best practices and ideas and your lessons learned. At one point last year, I believe you went back to Harvard Business School to take the Women on Boards, Succeeding as a Corporate Director learning opportunity. How did that change your trajectory and the way you're thinking about things? I'm sure it helped your network as well. What did you take away from all of that?
Yeah, it's a great question. It was a tremendous week-long course, and I really appreciated the opportunity to go back to Harvard and, to your point, to meet a lot of tremendous women. I think, there's a few things that I took away from it. One was, what is the future of the boardroom? And we talked a lot about that with some of our professors. We talked a lot about what it looks like today and what it could look like tomorrow, and how diversity really fits in and why it's important. I think we all see it and hear it in the news, and in some ways I feel like it's actually become a topic that people might even say they're tired of hearing about. But it's really important to tie that together to outcomes. And for example, obviously, the reality of adding more women to boards is increasing the value of these companies. And I think that was something that came out super clearly in the research and in a lot of the articles and cases we read. And so I think it just reinforced to all of us, this is necessary, not just for you, not just for your career, not just for your learning, but this is necessary for the state of business. And I think that was a real wake-up call to a lot of us where, we were excited about these types of opportunities, but it actually was almost like a calling. We left feeling like, okay, this is really something we've got to carry the torch forward on. The other thing I'll say is, interestingly enough, I was probably one of the younger attendees at that overall certificate and program. And I think that was good for me in many ways. I think it was also kind of similar to my previous comment. It was a bit of a wake-up call in another capacity because I think, I am younger and I can sometimes get overlooked as a result, but it's a type of diversity that I think is incredibly important too. And I think, there's a lot of evidence in the job market that age discrimination is working against older workers, but in the boardroom, it's almost the reverse. And the NACD, recently even said this, that, there are more directors 75 years and older than there are directors 50 and younger. And so for me, it was interesting to be there and realize that I was one of the younger individuals. And so it meant, there was a lot for me to learn, but also it meant that I wanted to take what I learned back to my colleagues. Because what I don't want to see continue is women start thinking about this much later in life. And so this trend continues, not only of, again, the age diversity piece getting lost, but also women still not joining boards at the rates that men do because they're obviously not able to prioritize or they're not being in earlier enough. And so, I care about this, and I think that it is fundamentally a game changer for your career. And I've learned so much from serving on the board that I can bring to my day-to-day job. And it really has helped me charge ahead and amplify my trajectory. So I think it could be a great boost for women as we continue building our leadership skills and grow as executives too. So again, that was another kind of key thing that I took away as well.
It's interesting. My first major board role happened in my 30s, and apart from me, it was pale, male, and stale, and there was a massive age gap between myself and most of the directors, and I guess I was the diversity play. I'm also ridiculously tall, so maybe it worked in that way as well. But you and I are both part of the 2020 Women on Boards movement, which is wonderful, and it's helping advance diversity as well as the 30% Club and some of the others, but in some ways it's been successful. Now, we would argue maybe 20% is a long way still to go, but it's been so successful, we're going to have to rebrand. Not only is next year 2020, but they've hit the 20%. So these are good things. We're seeing changes, and also there's recognition. It's not just gender. You want diversity of so much so you can have differences, but we're also seeing more, I don't know if I want to say alliances popping up, of people realizing it's not something you should do on your own. It's something you would do better in a group. We should hunt better in a pack. We can help and encourage each other, keep each other accountable. And I know just from the Harvard Business School education for the corporate directors, so we had Maria Garcia Nelson on the show before, And she was one of the first classes that came through there, and they built the sort of alumni base from that. And they have weekly calls where the groups are together and talking, encouraging, and helping each other. And I imagine that you've seen from this great ways to be working with other people that are helping you move forward. I'm sure that would be encouraging for audience. I wonder if you could speak to any of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And interestingly enough, actually, the group of women that graduated from the Harvard course, very similar to your comment, there was a organization formed out of that. And actually, there's been 3 classes from Harvard, and it's now formalized into a group called Women Execs on Boards, and it's very similar. So it's a group of women supporting other women in advancing their board search. And I think, to your point, there are a lot of organizations out there that are like this. 2020 Women on Boards is very similar. And I think I also realize that, to your comment, having all these groups in silos can actually be challenging, because then it actually feels like, well, should I join all of them? Should I join one of them? And I do see further consolidation or partnership happening, which is tremendous, because I do think that there's strength in numbers. And because a lot of these seats are filled by networking, you want to actually be connected to other groups that are out there. But I think one of the biggest things that I'm really encouraged by, 2020 Women on Boards does, but we actually, even forged a partnership in the Carolinas with University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill has a diversity initiative, and they're also working towards this related to board leadership. And we're going to do some joint courses together and think about ways that we can actually help to train individuals for board leadership, across the spectrum of diversity. And I think that's going to be a tremendous kind of partnership to ensure that we're reaching a broader swath of individuals and helping them, again, kind of get that training in a one-day period at a low cost in their local area. And I think that's going to be, again, a great way for us to reach more and more individuals, especially those that are working, a day job and don't have time or the financial means to take a whole week off. So there's a lot of groups out there. And I think more and more I'm seeing them partner together and really realize that, we're all driving down the same path, and we can do this work even better by working together.
And there's no reason to reinvent the wheel, right? It's great to learn from other people that have been there and done it and can partner with you and help you. And to that extent, I know you are passionate that people should be thinking about this earlier. Sooner than later is probably the right timing, is what you would say. And it's never too early to really start planting some seeds. And in many ways, I know some of our audience is actually thinking it might be 5 or 10 years out. I know I'm not in the C-suite or I'm a level below that yet, but this is a goal that I have and it's what I want to get to. What is the advice that you would offer people that are literally really good planners and really looking down the line?
Yeah, to your point, first and foremost, it is never too early. I have been a little amazed, actually, in talking to some tremendous people that I know in my community and telling them that I'm involved in 2020 Women on Boards, and them saying back to me, I've never thought of that. I've run 6 different companies as the CEO, but I didn't actually think about what value I could bring to a board. And so, again, I think it's never too early. And I really want to empower individuals, and especially women, to recognize what value they can bring to boards. And I think, starting earlier, like I mentioned, with a nonprofit or with a small startup or a private company is a great place to get that experience. But, regardless, get started, get involved. I think I got involved in nonprofits, like I mentioned, but then I also stay engaged with my educational institutions. So I reached back out to Harvard. I reached back out to UNC, and I'm now on, advisory and alumni boards there. And so, again, it's a great way for me to give back, but also to get other board experiences. And I can actually take away, what's going well with this one that I can bring to the other one, and vice versa. And so you can really bring great value in a variety of settings. So go out, have the experience in one of these venues, and then start thinking about, what's the next step? Is it private? Is it public board membership? And then the final thing I'll say is, I had to ask for a lot of help and get feedback. And I think it's important to recognize where you are in your journey. And so, as I mentioned, the program at Harvard really helps there, but there's also, workshops and conversations that you can attend in your local market, or you can even leverage some of the power of the executive search firms out there like Korn Ferry, et cetera. And I think a lot of those consulting groups actually can give you really great advice about, where you might be best suited as well that you may not have even thought of. So again, again, I think there's so many resources out there, but the biggest thing is don't take yourself for granted. It's never too early. Get started, get involved, especially somewhere you're passionate, and just start learning.
Exactly. And I think there's so many easy ways to plug in. For example, we have an episode with Martha Josephson of Egon Zehnder, and she wrote basically 2 guides there, The Path to the Boardroom for First-Time Directors and Writing Your First Board Biography. And it's an easy thing to pick up and really help you. You don't have to make it up on your own, come up from scratch. And similarly, Wharton, where I went for my MBA, they have a board service. In the same way they have like a job book, they have a board book for people that have the qualifications, and companies can come to them for free and find good candidates. And the same way that you're doing, I'm loving the giving back part. So I gave a presentation at Wharton recently about how to land your first board role. It was great fun for me to be sharing with the students who, I remember when I was sitting in that seat looking for that information. So I think all of that, where we're helping each other, I don't necessarily consider it paying forward because I just like talking about it and it's fun for me, but it certainly helps all of us as we're thinking about our own pitch and how we share it back. So I'm sure this was really, excuse me. Sorry, 1 second. I will edit that part out for sure. All right. So let me just write that down. Let me just pick back up there. So 3, 2, 1. It's really fun, I know, for all of us to be giving back in these sorts of ways, but also to be leveraging our experience and sharing that with others. And I know for our audience today, it was really helpful for you to be sharing so openly and transparently about the steps that you've gone through and the successes that you've seen and perhaps some of the hurdles that you had to go over. And I'm grateful for you for being on the show and sharing that with us. And I know for some people, they might like to know more about you and what you're doing. What would be the right way for them to follow up?
It's a great question. And I'd say I've really enjoyed kind of sharing my story. I feel like in general, the way I've learned is actually through the kind of generosity of others actually sharing their story and what they've learned. So I'm always excited to do that. And so for me, I'd say I'm obviously on LinkedIn. I have, a few podcasts and presentations out there on topics where I have some deep expertise like user engagement. But in general, I am not as active on other social media, but I welcome connections on LinkedIn and love talking with others about these topics. I'm also, as we discussed, the co-president of 2020 Women on Boards in the Carolinas. So you can come out to one of our events that we have in North Carolina and really trying to actually do more in South Carolina too. Or I can get you connected to another city. So again, it's a great organization to really learn more. We have annual events, but we also have trainings. And so it's a great place to start, especially building your network. So I'd say either of those avenues are great. And I'm, again, very excited to contribute in any way I can to other and individual journeys.
Well, we were delighted to have you on the show today, Jessica. Thank you for sharing your insights and helping all of us to be boardroom bound.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, too.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Jessica Bell Vanderwall. It was wonderful to hear her personal story about how her career shifted when she got her first board role to getting then a board role in the private sector, and how she's positioning herself now for future opportunities, how she goes about the branding and the networking and all the activities that we all need to do as we move forward in our board career. Now, if you head over to podcast.gordon.edu, you will find links to all the resources we talked about today. And please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are just so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content that we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.